So, last week I released a video showing the development of my Guardian class, but that video didn't show much of the more recent features of the class, which we've been working on since it was released last year. This is a sequel to that video. A lot of you asked me for more details on the class design and the quarterstaff subclass for Guardian, and this is going to be a more nerdy video than what I've done so far. Starting up with major changes, which I briefly mentioned at the end of the last video, Warhammers have been completely reworked. You can now see them charge, as your character actually holds them, and you won't lose their charge anymore if you don't throw them in time. They can also be swung while charging them, which stops the charge while swinging, but results in a net positive if you manage to hit the swing. They also received massive buffs to their damage, because they were very undertuned for the most part. I initially wanted them to be secondary weapons, made weak on purpose to compensate for Pavis's strength, but in practice this doesn't work, and they weren't fun to use at all. After these changes, Warhammers should actually be usable, especially in the early game, where you often need to react to enemies quickly, and can't afford to fly away, waiting for your weapon to charge. I've been thinking about adding more accessories to Warhammers, giving them more build options as a subclass. For example, I'd like to add a magnet, making them slightly home towards enemies and granting back some charge if you still miss. Another idea could be some kind of berserker charm, granting a lot of attack speed at full charge and allowing the player to bash enemies with melee swings. Wounds used to require a flat amount of slam charges to be triggered. This is not the case anymore, as the player can now charge them to gradually reduce their cost down to zero, effectively using them for free. This allows using them before a fight, and charging them mid-fight might actually be beneficial if you have a lot of melee speed. For example, if you're using the grass knuckles, which grants the player a ton of it after a parry. Runes can also be reinforced by fully charging them, past the point where they become free to use. When reinforced, they gain one more projectile. With this, all Guardian weapons except Pavis's can be charged, which is something we would like to address in the future, by allowing the player to charge a Pavis slam, like gauntlet punches. Damage reduction is somewhat of an issue in the base game. Because it stacks additively, it gains more and more value as you acquire more of it, which definitely shouldn't be the case. For instance, let's say the player has 50% damage reduction, reducing incoming damage by half. If they equip the Frozen Turtle Shell, which reduces damage taken by 25%, they will reach 75% damage reduction, at which point they only take a quarter of the damage. This means the Frozen Turtle Shell reduces the remaining damage taken by the player by 50%, giving it a lot more value than it should have. We want to give Guardian armor some damage reduction, because it just makes sense, especially in the endgame. But we also don't want the player to become invincible, especially if they're using other mods, which also happen to give damage reduction to the player. We changed Orchid's damage reduction to divide the damage taken, and be a separate stat from the vanilla one. It becomes less valuable if the player has multiple sources of it, but allows us to add some to our equipment without breaking the game, which is a good trade-off. The Guardian class has a lot of subclasses, because there's a lot of ways to use its resource system. If we keep finding cool ways to use it, that fit a purpose, and that we feel could be expanded upon, then we likely will keep adding more subclasses to Guardian. Quarterstaffs are somewhere between Warhammers and gauntlets. They can be charged by holding left click, allowing them to do a 2-hit attack that will recover resources if the player hits. Just like Warhammers, they can also jab by right clicking while charging them, which will stop their charge but grant a significant amount of it on hit. This makes them an option for resource generation, alongside Warhammers and standards. However, unlike the other, they specifically require a melee hit, making quarterstaffs the riskiest option of the three. By right clicking, quarterstaffs will parry, like gauntlets. But instead of generating a slam charge, they will immediately counterattack, dealing damage to enemies around the player. Quarterstaffs are self-sufficient. This is really good, when it works. As unlike with gauntlets, parrying projectiles is often useless. But when it does work, it's really fun. This time I want to share with you the ideas behind specific items, so you can understand how we think about the class content we add. Warhammers are one of the most important weapon types for Guardians, and the fastest ways to obtain one were to rush the jungle, which can be extremely hard if an evil biome spawned in the way, mining for gold or platinum, which is very time consuming, or finding one in surface chests, which is luck based, even though it's a relatively common item, and plenty of players are bound to find it quickly. There's always going to be that one person getting 12 wands of sparking in a row. Because of that, the first Warhammer was taken away from wooden chests. This means that the luck-based loot spot from chests was free to take, and we instead added the first quarterstaff in there. Because it's not as important of a subclass for Guardians, and so opening chests remains exciting for early game players. Taking example on the Mace and Wand of Sparking, it can then be upgraded with 99 torches, turning into the Flaming Quarterstaff, which is essentially a big torch and should help with exploring the caverns. Another non-luck based option is the Bamboo Pole, but this one requires going to the jungle. The Eater of World and Brain of Tulu both have plenty of targets to hit in melee range, and the Guardian class lacked a Shadow Orb and Crimson Heart loot. This was the perfect opportunity to add a Quarterstaff in there. The Wicked Fang from Corruption Orbs has a longer and stronger counterattack, perfect to deal with the Eater of Worlds, and Ricket from Crimson Hearts has a different single swing charge attack, dealing double damage and knockback, which should be nice to deal with the creepers. Next up is Parted Seas, which can be found in locked dungeon chests. This one is meant to be usable against the Wall of Flesh, and therefore requires special treatment. You don't exactly want to run into the boss and parry it, as I'm sure this is not gonna end well. It fires projectiles every time you jab, slam or counterattack, giving it consistent range DPS. This is the first quarterstaff with a projectile, and I'd like it to remain an exception, as quarterstaffs are supposed to be risky, close-ranged weapons. This is why Harmony, our early hard mode quarterstaff, is a fully close-ranged weapon, despite being meant to be used against bosses like the twins. At this point, if the player is still using quarterstaffs as their main weapon, they know what they're getting into anyways. Also, it's pretty fun against the Destroyer. Okay, so while writing this script, I opened the Orchid Workshop page and started reading the comments about the latest update. Apparently Corruptors dropped the Celestial Fragments for Guardian, and I have no idea how that went, not this time, so sorry. The following items were made or reworked by Ember, who has single-handedly doubled the quality standards for the mod's content going forward. Since Guardian is getting cross-content with the Thorium mod, it's natural that it should be able to actually clear the content from the Thorium mod. One of the issues we've had is how unfair the Grand Thunderbird fight is for Guardians. The boss stays away for the most part, firing projectiles at the player and summoning minions. The ghillie cover was made with this fight in mind. Crafted with living leaves, it breaks into multiple leaves when blocking instead of pushing the enemies around. This allows the player to deal big damage by blocking the enemies multiple times. Another interesting item rework is the Titanium Aegis. The Titanium armor set would intuitively be a good armor set for Guardians, generating a bunch of shards at melee range which deal significant damage. Unfortunately, Guardians suck at generating those shards, since they only trigger the set bonus once per hit. The Titanium Pavis was at the time a recolor of the Adamantite one, the same way Vanilla does with swords and repeaters. The new Titanium Aegis replicates the effect of the armor set, which both looks cool and actually synergizes with it, as the Aegis shards will trigger the set bonus. The Orichalcum Warhammer has a similar design. By hovering in the air, it allows triggering its corresponding armor set bonus easily. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing what we think about when adding new items. Let me know what you thought of it, and if you'd like to see more of these videos in the future. Everything you saw in this video is already released, and there's a link to the Orchid Workshop in the description. Thank you for watching.